Back in the harsh winter of 1878, the land itself seemed to hold its breath, covered in a shroud of unforgiving white that stretched from horizon to horizon. Snow lay heavy on the skeletal branches of trees, muffling sound, making the world a vast, silent, desolate place. The wind, a constant, biting presence, whipped across the high plains, scouring the frozen ground and seeking out any weakness. It howled like a thing grieving, a fitting soundtrack to the fate of Hannah, left alone against its fury. She lay huddled beneath a shallow overhang of rock, the meager shelter doing little to stave off the penetrating cold. Her coat, thin and ripped, offered scant protection. The snow had drifted around her, beginning to bury her where she lay. Her breath came in shallow, painful gasps, tiny clouds that dissipated instantly in the frigid air. Each breath was a victory, a desperate refusal to surrender to the icy grip tightening around her. They had left her here, just hours ago, though it felt like an eternity measured in suffering. The men who had promised passage, who had seemed so friendly back in Fort Worth. They had taken her few possessions, taken the money she had saved for years, and then, when she became inconvenient, when she protested, they had simply thrown her from the wagon miles from anywhere and ridden away, left her to freeze, left her for dead. Hannah was barely 20 years old. Orphaned young, she had worked tirelessly in a dusty Texas town, cleaning, sewing, saving every cent for a chance at a new life further west, where the promise of land and a fresh start beckoned. She had trusted the wrong faces, followed the wrong path, and now her dreams were freezing solid around her. Loneliness was a palpable thing, a cold, heavy weight pressed against her chest. Not just the loneliness of being abandoned, but the profound, aching solitude of facing her own end in a world that seemed indifferent. There was no sound but the wind, no sight but the endless white, no hope but the faint, flickering ember of her own will. She squeezed her eyes shut, trying to conjure the memory of warmth, of a kind face, of anything that wasn't this brutal, crushing cold. Hours bled into one another, marked only by the deepening ache in her bones and the creeping numbness that threatened to steal her consciousness. She was fading, she knew. The fight was leaving her. It was hard to breathe, hard to think, hard to care anymore. Surrender felt like a warm blanket, a release from the pain. Then a sound, or maybe she imagined it. A rhythmic thud against the snow, distinct from the wind. She forced her eyes open, squinting against the glare of the white landscape. Nothing. Just the snow, the rocks, the empty, endless sky. She closed her eyes again. The sound returned, closer now, hoofbeats. Slow, steady, approaching. Not the hurried retreat of the men who had left her. Curiosity, a weak tendril of something besides despair, pulled at her. She lifted her head, her muscles screaming in protest. Emerging from the swirling snow was a horse, dark against the white, and on its back, a man. He was lean, his face weathered, wrapped in layers of buckskin and wool. A wide-brimmed hat was pulled low, but she saw dark, sharp eyes scanning the terrain. He wasn't dressed like the settlers she knew. His features were angular, strong. He was Navajo. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through the numbness. Stories she had heard, whispers in town about savages, about danger in the wilderness. She had been warned. But then, they had left her here, the civilized men, and this man, this stranger, was the only living soul she had seen in what felt like days. He stopped his horse a distance away, his gaze fixed on the small, still shape huddled beneath the rock. Hannah couldn't move, could barely lift a hand. She simply watched him, her heart pounding a weak, frantic rhythm against her ribs. He dismounted, moving with a quiet economy of motion. He didn't rush. He approached slowly, his eyes never leaving her. Hannah braced herself, not knowing what to expect. More cruelty? Indifference? He stopped several feet away, assessing her with those dark eyes. His face was unreadable, etched with the lines of exposure and resilience. He looked from her to the tracks partially obscured by the drifting snow, the wagon tracks, the boot prints where they had dragged her. He saw, Hannah knew what had happened. He didn't speak, he simply stood there, a silent, imposing figure against the backdrop of the storm. Hannah shivered violently, a tremor that shook her whole body. It wasn't just the cold anymore. After a long moment he crouched down, his movements fluid. He didn't touch her. He reached out a gloved hand, not to her, but to the snow near her head. He scooped a handful, felt its texture, then looked back at her. His gaze was steady, neither hostile nor overtly kind, simply observing. Hannah found her voice, a raw, cracked whisper. "Please," she managed, the word thin and weak against the wind. He tilted his head slightly, a silent acknowledgement. Then, still without speaking, he stood up. Hannah's heart sank. He was leaving. He had seen, assessed, and decided she wasn't worth the trouble. It was the final, crushing blow. But he didn't walk back to his horse. He turned, his back briefly to the wind, and surveyed the small overhang. He looked at the depth of the snow, the angle of the rock. He seemed to be measuring something, calculating. Then he began to move purposefully. He went to his horse, took a shovel, a proper one, not a flimsy thing, from its saddlebag. He returned to the overhang and, with strong, rhythmic strokes, began to clear the snow. He dug down, deepening the hollow beneath the rock, creating a space more protected from the wind. He worked steadily, efficiently, his breath misting in the air but his movements showing no sign of strain. Hannah watched him, bewildered. He wasn't leaving, he was helping. The fear was still there, a dull ache beneath her surprise, but it was overlaid with a fragile, unbelievable thread of hope. He finished clearing the space, making it large enough for her to lie down fully, shielded from the direct blast of the wind. Then he returned to his horse again. This time, he brought back a heavy, folded blanket. Not a saddle blanket, but a thick, woven wool blanket, the kind that held warmth like a promise. He knelt beside her, still not quite touching her. He unfolded the blanket. "Here," he said, his voice a low rumble, quiet but clear, carrying a hint of accent she couldn't place. It was the first word he had spoken. Hannah hesitated, fear flickering again. He saw it. His expression remained neutral, but there was a flicker in his eyes, something that might have been patience, or perhaps just weary understanding. He didn't push the blanket on her. He simply held it out. Weakly, her fingers numb, she reached for it. The wool was rough against her skin, but it felt impossibly heavy, impossibly real. She pulled it towards her, fumbling with the folds. He watched her struggle for a moment. Then, carefully, without being abrupt, he reached out and helped her wrap it around herself. His touch was firm, deliberate, but not unkind. He tucked the edges around her, making sure she was covered from head to foot. The immediate rush of warmth was almost painful. She burrowed deeper into the wool, a small sigh escaping her lips. He still knelt there, watching. He reached into a pouch at his waist and pulled out a small, leather-wrapped bundle. He opened it to reveal dried meat and what looked like pounded berries mixed with fat. He offered a small piece to her. "Eat," he said. Hannah shook her head weakly. Her mouth was dry, her stomach cramped with cold and fear. He didn't insist. He simply placed the bundle within reach, near her hand. Then he rose. He went back to his horse, unsaddled it, and set about making a small, efficient camp near the overhang. He wasn't staying with her, not right beside her, but close enough that she wasn't alone. He built a small fire, sheltering it from the wind with a few stones he found nearby. The smoke curled thin and white against the gray sky. Hannah watched him through slitted eyes, wrapped in the blessed warmth of the blanket. He moved with a quiet competence, tending to his horse, checking his gear. He didn't look at her constantly, but she felt the weight of his presence, a silent watchfulness. As the fire took hold, casting a small, flickering circle of light and warmth, he sat beside it, facing outwards, his back to her. He seemed to be listening to the wind, to the silence. He was a sentinel, a protector. She didn't know his name. She didn't know why he had stopped, why he hadn't left her to her fate. He owed her nothing, yet here he was. The man they called savage had offered her life when civilized men had offered her death. The irony was a bitter taste in her frozen mouth. Over the next few days, the snow continued to fall, sometimes heavily, sometimes a fine, persistent powder. The wind seldom ceased its mournful cry. Hannah remained huddled under the overhang, slowly regaining strength. Her rescuer, she thought of him that way now. Though she didn't dare speak the word aloud, remained a quiet, constant presence. He brought her small amounts of food and melted snow for water. He spoke little, his words functional. Drink. Eat this. Stay warm. Hannah, too, spoke little. Fear still lingered, an instinct carved deep by her recent trauma and the prejudices she had absorbed. But alongside it grew a profound gratitude. She watched him. She saw the care he took with his horse, the way he replenished the small fire, always shielding it, making it last. She saw the lines of worry around his eyes when the weather worsened, not just for himself, she suspected, but for her. One evening, as the last sliver of bruised light faded from the sky, he sat by the fire, a silent silhouette. Hannah, feeling a little stronger, managed to sit up. "Why?" she whispered, her voice still weak. He turned his head slowly, his eyes catching the firelight. "Why what? Why? Why did you help me?" He looked back at the fire, poked it gently with a stick. He was quiet for a long moment. The wind filled the silence. "It is not right," he said finally, his voice low. "To leave someone like that, in the cold, alone." "But I'm white," she said, the words feeling foolish and small as soon as they were out. The prejudice was so ingrained. He turned his head again, his gaze level. "You are a person," he said simply. "A person left for dead. The snow does not care about the color of your skin." His honesty, his simple humanity, felt like a physical blow. It shattered some of the hardened shell she had built around herself, some of the fear and ingrained judgment. He saw her not as a category, but as a human being in need. "Thank you," she managed, tears unexpectedly stinging her eyes. "Thank you." He gave a short nod, acknowledging her words. He didn't offer comfort, didn't move towards her. It wasn't his way. But the silence between them shifted, becoming less tense, more shared. Days turned into a week. Hannah regained more strength. She could walk short distances now, stiffly, her muscles protesting, but walk. She helped gather small amounts of dried brush for the fire, a small gesture of contribution. He didn't ask her to, but he didn't stop her. They began to talk a little more, sparse conversations, functional at first, then slowly, hesitantly, venturing into personal territory. His name, he told her, was Takakota. He was from the Navajo nation, traveling. He didn't offer details, and she didn't press. She told him a little about her journey, the dreams that had brought her west, the betrayal. She spoke carefully, wary of burdening him, but the words, once released, flowed with a quiet intensity. Takakota listened, his gaze steady, his presence grounding. He didn't offer platitudes or easy sympathy, but his silence was a form of profound understanding. He had seen hardship, she knew, probably more than she could imagine. They learned to exist alongside each other, in a quiet rhythm. The vast, empty landscape and the relentless cold were their shared reality, the forces that had brought them together and now bound them in a fragile alliance. They were two souls adrift in a wide ocean, finding a small island of shared existence. Takakota taught her small things, how to read the subtle shifts in the wind, what animal tracks meant in the snow, how to conserve warmth. He didn't teach her in a formal way, but through quiet example and brief, pointed observations. Hannah, who had always relied on the structures of town life, found herself learning a different kind of resilience, one rooted in observation, patience, and a deep respect for the natural world. Her fear of him dissipated, replaced by respect and a dawning sense of trust she hadn't felt for anyone in a very long time. His quiet strength was a comfort, his presence a shield against the terrifying loneliness she had felt. One morning, Takakota announced they would move. The weather was easing, the heaviest of the snowfall passed, though the cold remained brutal. They couldn't stay indefinitely. He had to continue his journey, and she, though she had no idea where she was going, couldn't remain under the rock forever. He helped her prepare for the journey. He fashioned her a warmer cloak from some spare material he had, showing surprising skill with a needle and thread. He found her sturdy, albeit worn, boots among the meager belongings the men had left behind. He packed carefully, efficiently. Getting onto the horse behind Takakota felt awkward, alien. She had never ridden double before. His back was a solid wall in front of her, radiating warmth. She kept a respectful distance at first, holding onto the back of the saddle. They rode through the silent, snow-laden landscape. The beauty was stark, breathtaking, and terrifying. The vastness of it made her feel tiny, insignificant. But riding with Takakota, she wasn't entirely alone. His quiet competence navigating the terrain was reassuring. They traveled for several days. Takakota seemed to know the land intimately, guiding them through passes and along ridges Hannah would never have found on her own. He hunted small game, supplementing their dried provisions. He made camp each night, the small fire, a beacon in the immense darkness. Their conversations continued, slowly deepening. She learned a little about his people, their connection to the land, their traditions. He learned about her longing for a home, a place to belong, the pain of her past losses. They shared vulnerabilities, not through dramatic confessions, but in quiet, shared moments under the vast, star-filled sky. One evening, huddled by the fire, Hannah shivered despite the blankets. Takakota noticed. Without a word, he shifted closer, offering his own warmth. He didn't touch her, but the proximity was a comfort more profound than any words could have been. Hannah leaned her head back against the rock, closing her eyes, feeling a sense of peace she hadn't thought possible. She was still lost, still had nothing, but she wasn't alone. Their journey was not without peril. One afternoon, riding through a narrow canyon, they heard the sound of riders approaching from behind. Takakota immediately pulled his horse behind a cluster of rocks, signaling Hannah to be silent. Through a gap in the rocks, Hannah saw them. 4 men, rough-looking, armed. They were the men who had left her for dead. Her blood ran cold. They rode past the canyon entrance, heading in the same direction as Takakota had been going. They didn't see the hidden horse or the 2 figures crouched low. Hannah's heart hammered against her ribs. Takakota waited until the sound of their horses faded into the distance. His face was grim. He looked back at Hannah, his eyes sharp with concern. "They seek something," he said, his voice low. "Or someone." He didn't need to say who. Fear coiled in Hannah's stomach. They knew she was alive, or perhaps they were coming back to make sure the job was finished. Or maybe they were simply heading to the nearest town, where she would eventually need to go. "We cannot go that way," Hannah whispered. Takakota nodded. "There are other ways, harder ways." He didn't hesitate. He turned the horse and led them up a steep, challenging slope away from the canyon. The going was slow, treacherous in the snow. They had to dismount and lead the horse part of the way, scrambling over icy rocks. The physical exertion was immense, but the shared challenge, the silent cooperation required to navigate the difficult terrain, solidified something between them. Hannah, no longer the helpless victim, pushed herself, finding reserves of strength she hadn't known she possessed. Takakota watched her, a flicker of something akin to approval in his eyes. They spent that night in a small cave high on the mountain, colder and less comfortable than their previous camps, but safe. The encounter with the men had heightened the tension, bringing the reality of the danger Hannah faced back into sharp focus. Sitting by the fire, the air thin and cold even indoors, Hannah finally voiced the question that had been hanging between them. "If they find me, they won't just hurt me." She looked at Takakota. "They will hurt you too, for helping me." Prejudice wasn't just an abstract concept out here, it was a tangible threat. Men like those, they wouldn't hesitate to turn their violence on a native man, especially one who had interfered with their plans, helped a white woman they had discarded. Takakota met her gaze. His face was calm, resolute. "Then we will not be found," he said. "But what happens when we reach somewhere, a town?" Hannah pressed. "People. They don't like to see a white woman with. She trailed off, unable to say the word Indian. The ingrained prejudice still a thorny vine in her mind. Takakota understood. He had faced it his whole life. "Some people see only what they expect to see," he said quietly. "Others see what is truly there." He looked at her, a deep, knowing look. "You must decide which eyes you will see with." His words were a challenge, a gentle push. He wasn't just protecting her physically, he was challenging her to shed the fear and prejudice that had held her captive in different ways. The journey continued, longer and harder now, looping away from the more traveled paths. The landscape remained a character in their story, vast and indifferent, testing their endurance, pushing them closer together in their shared vulnerability against its power. They came across a small abandoned line cabin after nearly 2 weeks of travel. It was dilapidated, half buried in snow, but it offered more substantial shelter than the overhangs and caves they had used. It felt, to Hannah, like a mansion. They worked together to make it habitable. Takakota repaired the broken door, patched holes in the roof, cleared the snow from around the walls. Hannah swept the dust and debris, found a rusted stove and cleaned it as best she could. They gathered firewood, a painstaking process in the deep snow. The cabin became their refuge, small, drafty, but a place of their own, however temporary. They ate their meager meals by the fire, the small space feeling less lonely than the vast outdoors. The silence here was different, not empty and menacing, but quiet and shared. One evening, after a day of back-breaking work, they sat by the stove. Hannah watched Takakota across the small space. He was repairing a torn seam on his buckskin jacket with careful stitches. His profile was sharp against the dim light, his hands deft and strong. "You have saved my life," Hannah said, the words simple and true. He didn't look up from his work. "We helped each other survive," he corrected quietly. "The land is hard." "Still," she insisted, "those men, you didn't have to stop." He finished his stitch, tied off the thread. He looked at her then, his eyes steady in the firelight. "A debt," he said. Hannah was confused. "A debt? To whom?" "To the balance," he replied, his voice low. It wasn't an explanation she fully understood, but she sensed it was deeply meaningful to him. A spiritual obligation, perhaps, to set right an imbalance he had witnessed. In the days that followed, a different kind of rhythm settled over them. They were no longer just surviving, they were existing together in this small cabin. They spoke more freely now, the initial barriers of fear and mistrust long gone, replaced by a quiet understanding. Hannah learned about the long walk, the forced removal of the Navajo people from their homeland, the suffering, the resilience. Takakota spoke of his family, lost to disease and hardship, of his journey alone, seeking, he didn't say what. But Hannah suspected he was seeking a place, a purpose, a sense of belonging too. He learned about her family, gone to sickness, her years of scraping by, her desperate hope for a new life. He saw the deep well of sadness she carried, the fear that still lurked beneath the surface. But he also saw her quiet strength, her determination, the way she tried to make the desolate cabin feel like a home. They were two broken pieces, fitting together in the vast, empty puzzle of the winter landscape. Their differences seemed insignificant now compared to the shared experience of vulnerability, betrayal, and the resilience that had kept them alive. As the harsh winter began its slow retreat, the snow lessening, the days growing fractionally longer, the issue of their future became unavoidable. They couldn't stay in the abandoned cabin forever. "Where will you go?" Hannah asked one evening, the question heavy with unspoken implications. Takakota was quiet for a time. "I don't know," he admitted, a rare moment of uncertainty in his usually self-possessed demeanor. "There is not much left for me here." He gestured vaguely towards the east, the direction of the reservations, of the land his people had been forced onto, and from which he seemed to be a part. "And you?" he asked, turning the question back on her. Hannah looked around the small cabin. It was rough, bare, but they had made it safe, made it theirs, in a way. She thought of the dusty town she had come from, the hard work, the lack of kindness. She thought of the men who had left her for dead, a chilling reminder of the world out there. She looked at Takakota, sitting across from her, his face familiar and dear in the firelight. "I don't know either," she said softly. "My dream. It was just for a place to be safe, where I wasn't alone." The silence that followed was charged with unspoken emotions. They were two people from different worlds, brought together by violence and circumstance, finding solace and strength in each other. They had built a fragile bridge of trust across a chasm of prejudice and fear. Takakota rose, walked to the small single window. He looked out at the gray landscape, the distant snow-capped peaks. Hannah watched him, her heart aching with a mix of fear and something else she couldn't quite name, a fierce, protective feeling for this quiet, capable man who had saved her. He turned back to face her. His expression was serious. "The world outside, it is still hard," he said. "It will not be easy." "I know," Hannah replied. She thought of the judging eyes, the whispers, the open hostility they might face if they were seen together, especially if they went to a white settlement. "But," Takakota continued, his gaze holding hers, "we face the cold, we face the storm, We faced. He didn't name the men, but she understood. And we are still here. He walked slowly across the floor, stopping in front of her. He knelt down, something he rarely did. He reached out a hand, his strong fingers hesitant for a moment, then gently brushed a strand of hair from her cheek. His touch was light, tender, sending a tremor through her. "Perhaps," he said, his voice barely a whisper, "this place is a place to begin again." He wasn't talking just about the cabin. He was talking about the life they had found, together, here in the wilderness. Hannah's eyes filled with tears. They weren't tears of sadness, but of overwhelming relief and a fragile, overwhelming joy. A place to begin again, with him. The man who had seen past her circumstances, past the color of her skin, and seen only a person in need. The man who had offered kindness when others offered cruelty. She reached out her hand and covered his, pressing it against her cheek. His skin was warm, rough from work and exposure, but so very real, so very alive. "Yes," she whispered, the word thick with emotion. "Yes, here." They stayed in the cabin as the snow slowly melted, the land gradually shedding its white mantle. They worked on the cabin, making it more secure, more like a home. They hunted and gathered, relying on Takakota's knowledge of the land. They spoke of their hopes, tentative, fragile things, but spoken aloud, they began to feel possible. They knew the challenges they would face. The world outside was full of judgment, fear, and hatred for those who were different. They knew their connection would be questioned, condemned by many. But they had faced death in the biting cold and survived. They had found connection in the deepest isolation. They had seen the worst of humanity and found unexpected kindness in the most unlikely place. They weren't defined by the past that had broken them, but by the resilience that had seen them through and the unexpected bond that had healed them. They had built a sanctuary not just in the cabin, but in the space between them, a place of mutual respect, quiet understanding, and a love that had bloomed in the harshest of winters. The spring came eventually, tentatively greening the landscape. The world outside the cabin was still vast, still challenging, but it no longer felt indifferent. It felt like a world they could face, together. They had been left for dead, found by a stranger, and in the finding, they had found something infinitely precious, a home in each other. They had survived the cold, and now they could begin to live.